everybody. Thank you for coming out. And welcome to the Spring 2018 LS Squared Lecture. My name is Dr. Carrie Keebaugh, and along with Dr. Kara Kaufman, I'm one of the co-founders of LS Squared. The NSCC Liberal Arts Lecture Series, or LS Squared for short, is designed to promote dialogue about topics relevant to the liberal arts disciplines. It's a forum for the exchange and dissemination of ideas, a place to celebrate faculty projects and research, and a way to reach out and share our work with both the NSCC family and the broader community of which the college is part. Hello, good morning. I get to introduce this dude, so I'm excited.
Now can you hear me? Okay, so good morning. I get to introduce Lance. Lance Eaton has taught courses on popular culture, comics, literature, and history at North Shore for over a decade. He is also an instructional designer at Brandeis University and a doctoral student at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. He has published articles on post-9/11 narratives in comics, zombie narratives in the 21st century, ideology driving early Superman comics in the 1930s and 1940s, and the intertextual relationship between Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and the Incredible Hulk. His current research explores the problems of knowledge access in an age of copyright and digitization. His musings can be found at his blog, right up there, byanyothernerd.com. The title of his presentation is Vampires Get You Famous, but the Hulk Will Get You Sued: The Intersections of Creativity, Censorship, Copyright, and the Commons. Welcome, Lance.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here, kind of returning. I have been a student here, so I've sat in your seats. I was an instructional designer here for several years, where I've made many amazing colleagues, and in fact, met many amazing faculty here. And I also still, as I said, teach here. Before I get started, I just want to kind of thank a couple people for allowing me to kind of come here and ramble about some things that I find really interesting. So I do want to thank Dr. Carrie Keebaugh and Dr. Kara Kaufman, and I'm proud of myself. I kept messing that up when practicing. Your dedication to the liberal arts and creating a public forum for that engagement, I think, is a true asset of this institution. To Dean DeFosco Sullivan and Assistant Dean Bednar, who aren't here, but thank you to them for supporting such a program. To facilities for making a place such a hospitable and welcoming place for all to be here. And of course, to media services for all the work that you do and making me look presentable. I think your CGI budget must be enormous. And so I thank you very much for that. So the lecture that I'm about to give is just kind of this Frankensteinian creation of things that I've been thinking about, writing about, really engaged in for probably a decade or longer. And this opportunity to talk about it has been as rewarding for me and helping me sort things out as I hope it will be enlightening and interesting to you. And so we're going to talk about a lot of things today, a lot of interesting things, books and movies, comic books, monsters, things that we all enjoy, and particularly stories. We love stories, right? As the storytelling species on Earth, we just love stories. We want to read about them, we want to watch them, listen to them, we want to engage in them. We'll go onto social media and we'll like stories, or we'll comment and become a part of stories. We love stories. And they are very exciting to us. We all have our own stories to tell, right? And though it's not just one story. It's many stories. It's how I got into college. It's how I met my partner. It's how I got over some obstacle that I didn't think I was going to get to. So we love stories. They're exciting to us. But we're also going to talk about something that really isn't exciting to almost anybody, but of course, strangely enough, for me. And that's this. Can anybody tell me what this is?
That's the big C.
Oh, the big C. The big C. Circled and everything. And I heard somewhere over there, it's a copyright symbol, right? So, I know copyright isn't exciting. How many people are actually interested in copyright? Okay, you guys are all my friends, so that doesn't count. No. I've lectured you to death on this, so that doesn't count. But when we talk about copyright, it can be boring. Boring as fudge, right? Okay, some of you got that joke. We know some of the same stories. But copyright isn't that exciting, and I agree. In fact, I think I saw like 2 people in the back row already start to nod off when I started talking about this. But I'm hoping that by the time we're done here, you'll see copyright, as boring as it may be, is important to understand in how it impacts a lot of what we do, create, and engage with in today. So just kind of bear with me in this very first portion where we're going to unpack copyright to a degree that's at least comprehensible, and maybe not nearly as boring as we tend to think of it. So are we with me on that? No. Nope, I already saw 5 people leave. Okay, cool. So let's go with, what is copyright? Anybody want to take a stab at that? I love those crickets, they're my friends. Go for it.
The licensing of a product for a certain whole other time, such as like.
Dang, I didn't even pay him. He's almost got it like down, like, right? Now this isn't a god-awful, wordy definition of copyright, but it's basically to the degree that you were saying is that, you know, it is a protection of original works of authorship in any tangible form. And it is, you know, the idea is that works, particularly literary works, musical works, sound recordings, architectural works, which is one I'm always baffled with. And this is probably the most text-loaded slide that we'll have, but I just kind of want to throw it up there because, you know, this is that agreement that copyright is a bit wordy. So here's another question for you. Where does copyright come from? Does anybody know where in the United States copyright came from? The Constitution. Oh, do you teach in the legal arts? Right. Oops, jumping ahead a couple. Totally spoiler alert there. All right, so in the US Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, we have this clause that says to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So what this basically is saying is that people who create things, written works or patents for inventions, should have exclusive rights for limited time. But the question is why, right? Why should we allow them those particular rights? Well, what do we think? Oops, sorry, lost my spot. And this is my first time kind of using 2 things at once, so just bear with me. So why do we limit the amount of time one has to an exclusive right to a work, right? In that definition, in the Constitution, it says a limited time. Why do we have that? What do we think? Because? Excuse me?
Nobody steals your stuff.
So nobody steals your stuff. But I'm asking, why is it just a limited time?
So people can have access on, it's not monopolized.
Excellent. So people can have access so it's not monopolized. So what we have here is, like many things in Western tradition, we have this dueling tension that occurs. On one side, we have this thing called natural rights, and it's an argument that stems from the tradition of John Locke. Oh, sorry, not this John Locke. Good, people got that. Somebody was afraid nobody would get that. But we have this view from John Locke and others. And John Locke is kind of known as the father of liberalism, if I can say the word, liberalism. And we credit him with how we think of ideas today, particularly when we talk about intellectual property. So the natural rights view, as it's framed as such, kind of when we water it down, is that ideas spring into individuals' head, individual minds, and therefore are private and intellectual property. And this idea property, or intellectual property, represents potential wealth.
No.
Wow, this button just wants to go on its own.
Money.
And as individuals with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you are owed payment for anyone using your ideas. So this is kind of where that idea of copyright comes from. But we do have another view of this. And this is what we call the utilitarian view. And this says that individual creators are really creations of culture. That is, the individual's ideas are drawn from the culture in which they inhabit. If there is no culture, then the individual is not able to make said intellectual creation. And therefore, ideas are and should be a part of the common good for all to benefit from. Now, for some, this may sound strange, but this actually isn't that far off. We can see historically, time and again, new ideas, new patents, new technological breakthroughs often happen repeatedly at the same time, where several different people come up with the same idea. In fact, there's a term for this, and it's called multiple discovery. And the idea around this is often, historically, we have seen where there is a breakthrough, but it's not just one person, but several different people across a geographical location or across the world who come up with something at the same time. So there's different people we can credit with this utilitarian view, but in the United States, I'm actually going to give a nod to Thomas Jefferson. And in particular, there's a very famous quote of his in a letter that he writes to Isaac McPherson in 1813. And the quote is, "It is the action of the thinking power called an idea. He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper," which is basically a light, kind of like a lighter, "at mine, receives light without darkening mine. That ideas should freely spread from one to another over the globe for the moral and mutual instruction of man," I would say human, but that's okay, "an improvement of his condition, seems to have been peculiarly and benevolently designed by nature when she made them, like fire, expansible over all space without lessening their density at any point. Incapable of confinement or exclusive appropriation, inventions then cannot in nature be a subject of property." So all that he's saying here is, really, when we talk about ideas, we can't really frame them as property. Because if I share an idea with you, I don't lose my idea. My idea is still in existence. In fact, I've just doubled its capacity, because now I have the idea, and so do you. So, where am I going here? I really should work better at knowing how to work these. So when we see this idea of limited time, right, what we're seeing is this tension between that utilitarian view and the natural rights view. They're kind of like pulling at each other. And so this is how it becomes resolved. It becomes part of the culture, but after a limited time. But that does raise the question of, what do we consider limited times? If somebody says to you, this offer has a limited time, how much time do you think we have? I mean, in the age of Amazon, that could be minutes, right? So in the original Constitution, or shortly after the Constitution, the Copyright Act of 1791, how much time was allotted for copyright? Anybody want to take a guess? That isn't well-versed in laws?
What is it?
So in its original limited time, how much time was allotted to own the copyright before the copyright expired? People were like, I'm going to
Take it.
6 months.
6 months. Woo!
7 years.
7 years, getting close. Originally, it was 14 years, and then it could be renewed for another 14 years. So if you created an original work, you could profit from that original work as you saw fit for about 28 years. Does that seem like a reasonable amount of time?
No.
Yeah.
I've got 50, I've got no, I've got people like, who cares? I've got yes, affirmative. All right,
Give me the 28 years kickback.
the 20, say that again?
The kickback is for 28 years.
Basically, you can profit off that work for 28 years from when you publish it.
So how come my idea is only good for 28 years?
Great question. In the original time, that's what they had chosen. Anybody know how long copyright exists today?
Life.
Life of the creator plus 70 years. Now see, this is interesting because my own copyright on this presentation, if I live another 30 years, The earliest that this would be free for other people to use will be 2118, 100 years from today. So this term limited time, it's kind of weird, right? I mean, if I'm 10, 15, 20 years dead, my limited time on Earth has ended. But for some reason, this presentation will be protected for me for another 50 years after that. So limited time seems like a very strange or questionable term. Yep?
So you can put it in your will.
You could put it in my will, sure. But this idea of, if we go back to that utilitarian concept of, no work is necessarily entirely creative in and of itself, but is derived from the culture, there's a question about this idea of 70 years after my limited time, it's still not available to people. So one of the reasons I bring this up and to kind of talk about why this is the case is that largely this extension of time has been a result of publishers, not necessarily individual authors, who have lobbied Congress to make that time extend for 70 years, because ultimately it's the publishers who end up making and profiting from this. The vast majority of works that they own or that they end up having the copyright to, they end up profiting for another 70 years. And it's fascinating, and we'll take a look very shortly at kind of what that means for works that we all want to access and use. But here's a question for you. What happens after copyright expires? We say a copyright expires, what happens to it? Goes into the public domain. So then that's the question is, what is the public domain? Heard of it? Anybody ever heard of the public domain? Okay. So what is it? Sounds interesting, or not?
It's where old classical music goes.
It's where all classical music goes, right? Okay. Well, the public domain is a place where after a copyright expires, that work becomes free to use, republish, manipulate, change, do whatever you want with, because it's now part of the commons. It's now there for anybody to repurpose. So besides classical music, what are some other works that are in the public domain? Books. What particular books? The Shrunken Whites, Elements of Style.
Shakespeare.
Absolutely, Shakespeare.
Alice in Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland, right? Here are some works. They probably look a little bit familiar. You've probably heard of at least half of them, or most of the authors on the right. So these are many, many different works that are in the public domain that you can actually go and find and utilize in any way you want. Now, there is something between public domain and copyright, right? So we talk about copyright. Copyright is 70 years after the death of the author, and then public domain is like, you can do anything you want with it. But there is something in between called the Creative Commons. And the Creative Commons is a licensing that allows the creator to provide certain rights or reusability around a work and not have to wait 70 years after the death of the author. So for those that may or may not have noticed, at the beginning of this presentation, I had that logo right on it. And that is, just like the copyright symbol, that's the Creative Commons symbol. And what that symbol says is, you are free to reuse and repurpose my presentation. It's also why I have the link to the presentation. You're free to reuse it as you want, with two stipulations. One is that you give me credit, and the other is that whatever derivative work you create from it, you share it with a Creative Commons license. So these are two of those potential stipulations you can create with a Creative Commons license. But it's a nice way of having this in-between space, between kind of the 70 years after I pass away and it being in the public domain. You can actually also nowadays put your work directly into the public domain if you choose. All right. So thank you for bearing with me. That's kind of like the crux of what we're talking about, or we need that foundation to move forward. And I realize, technical jargon, copyright, public domain, and the legalese of this, it can all get us just a little bit right. We're all kind of feeling like this, and I get it. So thank you for bearing with me. So what we just talked about is how a work goes from being owned by an individual to being part of a culture. When a work enters the public domain, we consider it becoming part of the commons, right? The cultural commons. And we use commons in the term, same way that we use the term when we say something like Salem Commons or Lynn Commons. These are places in which we are, at least should, all be able to take a part of and enjoy. So creators can choose to actually, you can choose to put their works into the commons by using, as I said, those Creative Commons licensing. So what we've largely done here is identify this tension between copyright and public domain. That is the personal interest of the individual creator and the public interest of the culture. And the argument isn't whether there should be copyright to protect creators, but it's really about the degree. Because as we've seen, 70 years after the life of a creator can feel a little bit extreme. Because after all, if we take a look at these works, I would ask the audience, the date on the right is when these authors have died. How many of us were alive when they were? Right? So the thing is here are authors that for most of us in this audience were dead before we were born. But their works still won't be in the public domain for anywhere for another 10 to 15 years. If you've taken world or American literature, hopefully here, hopefully with our amazing faculty here, you'll notice many of these are well-known and established authors, authors that we're still talking about today. But there are also authors that are long dead. And so every time you want to go and use or enjoy these amazingly rich authors, you have to pay a publisher who's directly profiting from something that at this point we consider a cultural, a clear cultural work. So, lost my spot. So we can think of the commons as a intellectual space where we are free to draw upon, use, alter, and reproduce the creative works of the past into the present. And this can be done in many interesting ways. It can give us such fascinating works as Pride and Prejudice, and Zombies. Right? This is the story of Pride and Prejudice, but interspliced with a plot line involving zombies. Now, for some of us, this might not be the most glowing example of what you can do with the commons. Maybe you're not into pale, mindless humanoids groaning their way through life. Or maybe you're not just that into zombies. So, my literary friends appreciate that. So, this may not be a great example, but you know what is a great example? Is the Iliad. So, the Iliad is the story written by this guy we call Homer. And just like sequels were popular back then, he follows this up with a sequel called what? Oh, I hear The Odyssey, right? And these two books have been super influential in Western literature for millennia, right? For almost 3,000 years. And while Homer thought what he was writing was this like epic history in the form of an epic poem, we kind of look at it now as historical fiction. But he does produce this enormously popular and influential work. And it's so popular and influential that people have been riffing off it for thousands of years. There's many, many examples I could draw from, but I'm just going to kind of stick to the highlights. So if we jump forward to the 400s BCE, we get the Oresteia trilogy, which, yes, trilogies were popular back then too. But in the Oresteia trilogy, we have characters from the Iliad and the Odyssey having their own little story after the fact. Now, back then, they called it the literary tradition. Today, we just call it fan fiction. Jump ahead to 100 CE, or to the 1st century CE, and we have another story called the Aeneid, in which Virgil takes characters from the Iliad and crafts this entirely new plot line. Now, this is kind of like Star Wars Rogue Story, right? Rogue One, where you kind of have this new story that you didn't necessarily need, but what the hell, we're going to tell it anyways. You can jump forward to another couple, a millennia later. And you've got more examples. You have Dante, who in the Inferno features Odysseus in the 8th level of hell. For me, reading the Inferno was my version of the Inferno, but that's beside the point. Right? So Odysseus from the Odyssey shows up in the Inferno. Then you have Chaucer, who writes this poem, this epic poem called Troilus and Cressida, which is based off of characters in the Iliad, and kind of a, how these two characters get dragged into the violence and the politics of that story. Now, our friend William Shakespeare adapts Troilus and Cressida, which itself was already adapted. So that's kind of like an adaptation squared. And William Shakespeare basically fanfics this story into a play. And yeah, I just totally used the word fanfic as a verb, which may upset some grammarians. Probably not nearly as much as the fact that I just, said William Shakespeare fanfics, because he's supposed to be this great playwright, but he was borrowing from other people. He was taking stories from the past and recreating them. So, if it feels like everyone is borrowing from everyone, they are. And that is a history of storytelling in a nutshell. That constantly we are finding story time and again being told and retold. For instance, if we take a look at kind of where the Odyssey is today, we have these great examples of books and films and comics. In fact, under films, Troy the Odyssey, which I'll tell you is painful to watch, save your time. Troy, Fall of the City, both of these just dropped on Netflix in the last month. Fall of the City, I'm 4 episodes in, I'm still on the line about. But it's 2,000 years after Homer wrote this thing, and we're still talking about it. We're still retelling it. We're still engaging with it. And these are just stories that retell the Odyssey and the Iliad in the time of ancient Greece. We also have a bunch of stories that take the premise of the Odyssey and modernize it or retell it in some new and interesting way. So there's loads of fiction that has been doing this and continues to do this. This doesn't even count. Oops, lost my spot. There we go. This doesn't even count all the specific TV shows, like individual episodes or short stories or anything like that that has been adapting this story. Do you know how I learned about the Odyssey? My first encounter with the Odyssey was DuckTales. Right? Long before I ever read the Odyssey, I was mesmerized it because Uncle Scrooge, Huey, Dewey, and Louie decided to, had something to do with falling through a time warp or whatever, but that's where I learned about the Odyssey. The Odyssey was interesting enough that in the 1980s, people thought it was a good idea to turn it into a story in Disney with Disney characters. And it worked. It hooked me on it. So why am I talking about a storyteller from 3,000 years ago? Who cares? Well, this was a popular story. And it still is a popular story. It's one that we come back to time and again. And we've done that with many stories in our past. I mean, I did this with the Odyssey and the Iliad, but I could have just as easily used stories from the Bible, from Dante, from Beowulf, from Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe, or Sherlock Holmes. We see these stories told back time and again. We revisit these reasons for the same reason. All right, so you could not step into the same river twice. Now, what this means in this context is that we come back, every time we come back to a story, it's different. We are different. When we reread or retell stories, we're thinking about how both have changed, the story and ourselves, since the last, oh, she really doesn't like stories. Since the last time we encountered them. That's what we've been doing for millennia. In that vein, remakes or sequels or trilogies, they're not a sign of unoriginality, but they're a sign of trying to engage with our past, to consider and look at what we might have missed, or how we make sense of stories in the present. I find retelling of past stories just fascinating and exciting, because they pick apart things that we likely miss, or make us think about them in different ways. These are as rich and creative works as those stories that don't call upon past works. But again, why does it matter in the context of copyright and commons? Well, here's the first big point. Right? It's in big letters, so you know it's a big point. Right? We can engage with the past stories in creative retelling only when they are part of the commons, that is the public domain. And this is important because it is a dialogue with and reflection about our past in reconciliation with our present. It's a powerful opportunity to understand how the two fit together. But that only happens if we're able to freely draw upon such work. Consider this. Imagine that you are 75 years old and you want to write your autobiography, but you can only draw upon your memories, your stories, from before you were 25. How good of a story, how accurate of a story could you tell about yourself? Right now, we can draw upon tales, but we can only do it with works that are either published before 1923 or with creators who've died before 1948. That is, most creators will never get the chance to play with works that were created in their lifetime, or even before they were born. The only exceptions, of course, are when copyright holders grant permission in the form of Creative Commons licensing, or sometimes even within the confines of copyright. But usually in those cases, it's a highly restrictive and controlled license. And I think this is a loss for us, both creatively and culturally. It denies the opportunity to explore our immediate past and engage with what it might mean. So just to recap, kind of see where we are and make sure we understand what's going on here, is we've discussed copyright and where it comes from and what it does. We've discussed the commons and traced the ways in which commons offer opportunities for new stories. And we've discussed the ways that copyright protects the creative works of the authors, but at the same time restrains the creativity of other authors. So again, we have this tension, between copyright and the commons. Both push and pull on creativity, right? So then let's talk about that fourth C. Oh, looks like it found us. We apparently have been censored. So what are we going to do about that? I guess that's an option, right? Let's just pretend what we see here is something really cool. It's an amazing, amazing visual. Oh, I guess somebody's ruining it for us. So let's move right along. Oop. Come on, you can do it. There we go. All right. So, how do we feel about censorship? In the United States, we generally do not like censorship, right? We find it problematic in the modern context. This is actually, one of the most challenging things we're grappling with today is how we reconcile people with a hateful and violent agenda and whether or not they deserve censorship. So with the First Amendment, we are disinclined to oppose censorship in any official capacity with with certain limited exceptions. But historically, creative works have been the subject of a great deal of censorship within our country and beyond. So what could be said and shown has been historically restricted. Even in the 20th century, we saw several censorship laws and even industries practicing censorship upon threat of government censorship. They included the Hays Code, which was for films, the Comics Code Authority, which, for people that don't know, lasted until 2011, and the Comstock laws, some of which are still in play today, and that related to written materials. So censorship is a tricky thing, and I'm certainly not going to argue for it, but the idea of censorship, the idea of restriction can in fact make us incredibly creative. And if you don't think so, when we have rules that we don't want to follow, we find amazing ways to get around them. How many of you have siblings? Okay. How many of you have been told not to hit your sibling? Come on, be honest. We'll censor out this part of the video, okay? Right. So despite being restricted, being told you can't do that, how many of us found ways to hit our siblings? Okay, right? Right? Or found other ways to do something that's just psychologically as horrible, right? Like walking up to him and being like, I'm not touching you, right? I mean, my brother was great. He would take my hand and just start beating me, being like, stop hitting yourself, right? we're amazingly creative when we don't want to follow the rules, when we're being restricted, or when we're being censored. So, I think that's something interesting and worth thinking about, is that we will regularly try to find ways to get around the rules. When I was 7 years old, I was told I could not come out of my bedroom doorway. I was in trouble. So, what did I do? I jumped out the window, right? So, restrictions can make us really think outside the box or the window, as the case may be. And we see this in many, many different forms. But I want to talk specifically about poetry. Now, everything from sonnets to limericks to haikus, they all have restrictions on what you can do. And from that, we get amazing, interesting, fascinating works. In music, we restrict songs on the radio to 3 to 4 minutes. And we still create many, many amazing songs that we can't get out of our head years later, right? I've got like 3 running in my head right now. So restrictions, which is in essence censorship, do have an interesting effect on us. And this is true in the 19th century. In the West, we have like this serious obsession about sex. It's so serious, in fact, so obsessed about it that we don't want people to talk about it. I mean, we're so weird about it that we decide it's easier to tell children that somehow a bird with a giant mouth somehow flew us and then dropped us down a chimney like a coconut carried by a swallow, rather than simply saying we came out of a woman's vagina. Think about that. Yes, Junior, you came from a flying bird delivery service. It was kind of like Uber Eats program, but with birds dropping babies like bombs. So, in the 19th century, at the birth of mass-produced text, writing about sex was frowned upon, and yes, censored at times, and was attacked in many different ways, either censored by the publishers or censored by the courts and government. So what did that mean for the stories that we tell? Pretty much, sex was everywhere. Because they couldn't talk about sex, they tried to find ways to instill it into literature all the time. Now, it's not directly in plain sight, but you peel back that subtext of a story, and you're going to find a lot of sex. In fact, if you don't believe me, be sure to take literature courses here.
Shakespeare.
What's that?
Shakespeare.
Shakespeare, absolutely. Be sure to take literature courses here. And if your professor doesn't talk about all the sex that's going on in that literature, be sure to ask for your money back. So one of the best places to find stories that are all about sex without ever having to talk about sex are vampire stories. As sex symbols, they gained popularity in the 1800s. Most of us know about Bram Stoker's Dracula, right? But its popular predecessor was Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. And in both cases, we see the seduction and hypnotic trance of young women who inevitably become tainted by their encounter with a vampire in the story. And yes, vampires are great vehicles for sex when you're uncomfortable or not willing to talk about sex. And why not? They're eternally youthful. They prefer the dark. Their means of infecting you or making you impure is by penetrating you with their sharp phallic fangs. I mean, it's a very intimate interaction. In the result of such an interaction, you become pale, ill, and die, which means you may have gotten yourself a sexually transmitted infection, or you live to feed on others and therefore breed more vampires. That's sex in a nutshell. And here's where you discover why vampires will make you rich. They're monsters from the commons that largely represent sex. And the funny thing about humans is we're as interested in sex as we are about stories. And so you put the two together and you get yourself a triple word score on Scrabble. That's words with friends on your phone. So that brings me to point number 2. Censorship can produce fascinating ideas that stick with us long after the censorship has gone away. That's not an endorsement of censorship, but an observation of it. When censored, humans find amazing ways to circumvent it. Would vampires be as popular today if writing about sex was not censored in the 1800s? Think about the thousands of books, comic books, movies, short stories, podcasts, video games that feature vampires. Everything from Count Chocula in The Count on Sesame Street, to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, to Castlevania, to Van Helsing, and much, much more. But of course, censorship in storytelling is much less prevalent in the present than in the past. But vampires are still as popular. So let's check in one more time as we kind of move forward here. We've recognized the importance of copyright, the power of the commons, the tension of censorship altogether in creativity. It gives us a lot of ways to think about creativity. And finally, we've learned why vampires are a great opportunity to make money. So it's now time to turn to understanding why the Hulk will get you sued. Are we ready for that? Well, like, sure, why not? I can't go anywhere. I'm stuck with 5 people on either side. So, in order to talk about the Incredible Hulk, we actually have to talk about a person named Edward Hyde. Who is Edward Hyde? Say that again. The monstrous version of Dr. Jekyll. Good, right on. So, we all know the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or maybe some of us don't. So, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a novella that was published in 1886. And the novel dealt with the strange relationship of one Dr. Henry Jekyll, and yes, that's how they pronounce it, Jekyll, in one Mr. Hyde. Now, what we don't know about them is the relationship, at least within the story. We do find out that they are, of course, one and the same. Dr. Jekyll creates a formula that he takes, and it turns him into Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde is a man without conscience or restraint. Hyde sets up life in the shadier part of town, commits murder. People know there's some kind of relationship between him and Mr. Jekyll, him and Dr. Jekyll, but nobody's sure what. And in fact, in one line in the story, in one singular line, they hint that Hyde could either be Jekyll's son, bastard son, or his lover. Right? So in this one line, you have this character, Mr. Enfield, who is very prim and proper, and they're trying to figure out the relationship between the two, and he's like, well, blackmail, I suppose, an honest man's paying through the nose for some of the capers of his youth. So again, this is written in 1886. They're still not talking about sex, but readers of the time are going to know that this is a reference to all sorts of questionable acts by Dr. Jekyll. So we've established who Edward Hyde is. I'd like to ask, what does Hyde look like? After all, if you've never even read the novel, there's still been over 30 film adaptations, 14 TV show adaptations, and also appearances in dozens of TV shows such as Penny Dreadful, Once Upon a Time, Looney Tunes, Tom and Jerry, Scooby-Doo, and of course DuckTales. And he's even had 2 of his own video games. So what does Hyde look like? Anybody want to take a stab at it? That's fine. We can actually just take a look at these versions of Hyde, right? So are these accurate depictions of Hyde? Or are these accurate depictions of Hyde? There's some distinct differences between those two sets, right? In the earlier image, Hyde is small and diminutive, but in the later, he's big and bulky. So how do we explain these differences? Well, we can first take a look at the descriptions of Hyde from Stevenson's novella, right? Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave the impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. Hyde was small. He was small, with the shocking expression of his face, with his remarkable combination of great muscular activity and great apparent debility of constitution. Rather, as there was something abnormal and misbegotten in the very essence of the creature that he now faced me, something seasoned, surprising, and revolting. Those are interesting descriptions of Hyde, and they certainly sound more like that first set of images. Whereas the second set of images were all from within the last 20 years. So my argument, or the way I would explain that, would be this guy, the Incredible Hulk. So there's a good chance you know who the Incredible Hulk is, but let me just give you a little bit of background. He was created in 1963 by Stan Lee, or as most of us know him, the guy that keeps showing up in those Marvel movies. And Bruce Banner, who is Incredible Hulk, I hope I didn't spoil that for anybody, he's a scientist who's testing this thing called a gamma bomb when he finds there's somebody on the test field. So he goes and he saves that person, but he exposes himself to the gamma bomb's radiation, and that eventually produces the Hulk. So we can already see some similarities between Dr. Banner and Dr. Jekyll. Both are gentlemen scientists, both are exposed to experimental science of their own making, and both become a monster as a result. But beyond that, the Hulk has a couple other inspirations. The first is, yes, there we go, is actually the Thing from the Fantastic Four, which I don't think many people actually know about. The Thing, Stan Lee was looking to replicate the Thing when he created the Hulk. Right? The Thing is this self-hating superhero, and this is exactly what Lee has said. I wanted to take the Thing and I wanted to kind of explore that more. But, stop that. There we go. The Hulk was also inspired by Boris Karloff's Frankenstein, right? And if you look at that original Incredible Hulk on the right and compare it to kind of the frame, the headshot of Boris Karloff as Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster, you can see they are very, very similarly depicted. So the Incredible Hulk had a little bit of everything. He was adapted from the Thing, he was narratively inspired by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and he was visually inspired by Karloff's Frankenstein. So here's a fun question for my comic friends. How does Bruce Banner turn into the Incredible Hulk? When he gets what?
Pissed off.
When he gets pissed off, right? When he gets angry, when he gets mad, when he gets excited, right? Which is actually, when we think about the kind of Victorian emotional repression that's going on, we can see how well Hyde and Hulk are aligned. But here's a fun fact and an additional lineage of the Hulk. He was also inspired by werewolves. In the original 1960s comics, the Hulk didn't turn into the Hulk when he got mad. He turned into the Hulk when it became night. So what we see here is this popular and creative work, The Incredible Hulk. It's absolutely its own unique mixture, but it directly draws upon no less than 4 different stories. It drew upon the Fantastic Four, which was another Marvel property. It drew upon Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It drew upon Boris Karloff's Frankenstein. And Frankenstein itself, at this point, was a public domain work. And it drew upon werewolves, another public domain work. So when we look at this, we see, when we think about the Hulk, 3/4 of it came from the public domain. 3/4 of it was inspired enough from the public domain, and the other work was something that Lee could already freely take from. So it raises a really interesting question of, could the Incredible Hulk have been created or as popular without drawing upon the public domain? So keep that thought in mind. We're going to come back to it in a few minutes, but just keep that in the back of your head. So we still need to answer this question, how we get from this Hyde to this Hyde. And hopefully by now you're probably piecing together the answer. So the Incredible Hulk has been incredibly popular. He's had 5 of his own TV shows, including the 1966 cartoon series, the live action series that many of us may have seen or watched or kind of laughed at. He's appeared in many other TV series. He's appeared in comic books and books. He's had, I think, 5 video games. He's very, very popular. He's also been in his own, he's been in the Avengers series and things like that. But I think if we want to understand the kind of the popularity of the Hulk, we could probably look here, because I wouldn't say I've looked all over the internet, but I'm kind of impressed with the fact that nowhere have I found Hyde being sold as ladies' lingerie. But the Hulk, apparently the Hulk, if I can stay on this, there we go. Apparently the Hulk can be sold as ladies' lingerie. And I will not lie, I have all sorts of questions to ask, but we'll wait till later to find those out. So all of this is to say that our modern visual conception of Hyde is very much informed by the Incredible Hulk. In part because Jekyll and Hyde give us a popular and well-known story, but it ends with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde dead. Oh, spoiler alert, they died. This means that there's not much direction that the story can take. People have definitely created alternative takes on the story, and those are some of my favorites, such as Valerie Martin's Mary Riley or Daniel Hyde's Hyde, but in the end, the story has trouble going beyond that. Meanwhile, the Incredible Hulk gives us all the flavor of Jekyll and Hyde, but it's been an ongoing narrative for 50 years. So it's no surprise that given the overlap, we see Hyde becoming more Hulkish. But this is where we come to the dilemma posed by this lecture's title. The Hulk will get you sued. As we already learned, vampires can make you famous. Dracula, as a public domain entity, has appeared in over 50 movies, of which he was in the title. He's appeared in hundreds of TV shows, books, comic book, video games. And yes, he also has his own underwear. It's a shame we didn't do this before Valentine's Day. But the contrast I want to draw here is that we are free to draw upon the commons, and we do so regularly. And from the commons, we get some really amazing, moving, and intriguing works. And we also get a lot of crap, but we get some really cool stuff. But we get to take those ideas. Play and adapt. We get to play and adapt and infuse them with new meaning. And it's something that Lee got to do with the Hulk. And it's something many master creators will do at some point in their life, is take things from the common and repurpose them. However, we're free to only do this with stories of the long past. We cannot do it with the recent past. And the Hulk is a great example of this. Now, the Hulk is 55 years old. His creator, Stan Lee, is 95 and still chugging along. This means that pretty much for all of us in the room, Hulk will never be in the public domain. Think about it. Even if, God forbid, Stan Lee died today, the Hulk wouldn't enter the public domain until 2088. So that's 125 years after its creation. So why does this matter? Because if copyright existed in the past, as it does in the present, so many of the works that I've mentioned already would never have had the legacies that they've experienced. Right? So when we look at these works, the first is the title of the work, the second is the author, then the date in which they died, and the date in which their work would become public domain. Right? Even Stan Lee would have had trouble getting his Incredible Hulk published. We wouldn't see so many of the adaptations of Dracula until 1982. Wizard of Oz and the many incantations of that, 1989. Sherlock Holmes, just in 2000. In fact, War of the Worlds, which is one of my favorite stories, we would have been denied the most famous rendering of War of the Worlds. Right? People are familiar with the 1938 version of radio adaptation of War of the Worlds, where Orson Welles creates this very fun, amazing, engaging broadcast that scares the bejeepers out of a lot of people. Enough so that many of them listening thought, oh my gosh, aliens are actually invading. I mean, it was the original fake news. But we've been denied all of these types of stories and all of these types of retellings. So for me, this is really where copyright works as a form of de facto censorship. It prohibits works from entering the public domain and won't enter the public domain until decades dead. And even those works, such as The Incredible Hulk, were largely created from the public domain, but refuses to be a part of it. And I promise, I'm not saying this because I'm really itching to tell an amazing Incredible Hulk story. I promise that's not the case, but I found The Incredible Hulk as this creature of the public domain to be a fascinating specimen to examine within this context. So there you have your answer of why using the Hulk will get you sued, and why vampires, well, will make you famous. But again, frustrated as I am about this de facto censorship, what I have seen is an amazing splurge of creativity within works in the commons. Some of my favorites are stories that use the commons quite effectively. For instance, I'm a fan of The Walking Dead, more of the comic than the TV series. But there you have a zombie, a modernized monster of folklore that is, again, in the commons. I'm also a super duper fan, yes, super duper fan, of the Fables comic series. And this is a series that takes all of those characters from Fables. If you've watched Once Upon a Time, this is a much better version of that. It takes all sorts of characters from all sorts of folklores and puts them in downtown New York City for all sorts of fun. I truly loved Penny Dreadful, which took a lot of Victorian stories and mashed them all together. And I certainly enjoyed recently the Frankenstein Chronicles, which just dropped on Netflix as well. So we have all of these amazing like intertextual stories that come together and are just so much fun to enjoy and see how people take, or see what directions they take with them. And I'd say, in fact, one of the most creative and kind of fascinating things to emerge out of this is steampunk. So for those unfamiliar with steampunk, it's a genre that blends elements of science fiction, often with the Victorian novel or the Western novel. Stories typically take place in the 19th or 20th century, with the predominating technology being steam or pre-electric technology. It created in such a way that it can do many of the things of the modern world, just often differently. So many, but not all of these steampunk stories will include characters and figures from that era, such as characters in the public domain. It becomes this curious blend. It's like, no, you can't go for it. There we go. It can create this curious blend of future and past, a setting and an atmosphere that can be used to tell other genres and retell previous stories. If you remember a few years ago, there was Robert Downey Jr. starred in 2 Sherlock Holmes films. And if you remember, kind of it looked very cutting edge in terms of the technology when we think of the 19th century, but that was a film inspired by steampunk. Here are other retellings of famous stories. So you have Wizard of Oz, you have Dracula, you have Frankenstein, and of course, William Shakespeare. And these are all works in which they take those stories and use this genre of steampunk to retell them. So each of them kind of retells those classic stories, but using kind of a bit of science or a bit of steampunk technology and a whole lot of what if. So my argument here would be that part of the reason steampunk exists is because the desire to engage and use our past to explain our present. But with so much of our immediate past, really the last 100 years, locked behind copyright, it's easier to use and draw upon and experiment with works that are older. So vampires are going to be free, but the Hulk is going to cost you. So here we are at the intersection of censorship, there we go. Here we are at the intersection of censorship, copyright, creativity, and commons. We've explored where copyright comes from. We've looked at how valuable the commons are. And we've examined how censorship can work directly and indirectly. Maybe, there we go. And most important of all, we've seen how creativity is woven through all of this. If I have any parting conclusions, it would be this. If you wish to be a creator, think about how much previous work has impacted your creativity. None of us create entirely new things. We're constantly building upon that which we have explored and been exposed to. And when creating, recognize the impact and limit of the locking away of your work with traditional copyright. Copyright is granted upon creation, but you as the creator can adjust your copyright as you see fit. You don't have to lock it away for 125 years. We could use Creative Commons in order to make the work more available at some point, either immediately or later in the future. And for those of us that consume creative works, Find and support creators who make their work readily available. That is, look for creators who use licensing like Creative Commons. Okay. Here's a list of many different authors and creators. Anybody ever play Cards Against Humanity? Did you know that they're covered by a Creative Commons license? Right? This means you can actually do, it'll tell you what the limited restrictions are, but you can make copies of those without legally being held responsible. If you read the comic series, the web comic series, XKCD, that's created with Creative Commons license. If you know the fiction and nonfiction writer Cory Doctorow, most of his stuff is created with Creative Commons licensing. Even 9 Inch Nails has put out CDs that have Creative Commons licensing. So there's an abundance of works out there. Here are just a handful. But beyond these, there's plenty of places you can go to find creative works that are either in the public domain or use Creative Commons licensing. The Internet Archive, I will warn you, if you do go there, be prepared for like large vacuum of time to just disappear. I've been known to kind of go there at like 3 o'clock, and the next thing I know, it's 2 a.m. in the morning, and I'm wondering where the last 11 hours are gone. They have an amazing assortment of things. And I'm not going to lie, one of my favorite things that the Internet Archive has is the Oregon Trail for free. Right? So there's games, there's videos, there's movies, there's comic books, there's all sorts of stuff there ready and available. These are other sites that you certainly can use if you're an audiobook fan, because I certainly am. LibriVox has free audiobooks. There's all sorts of books. Like if you're taking American Literature 1 or World Literature 1, you can often kind of look at some of these places to maybe not have to buy the books that you're getting assigned. But there's a lot of work, and there's even search engines where you can go and find works that have Creative Commons licensing. So let me just end with this, is that Jonathan Goshtal calls humans the storytelling animal. We more than any other species create, tell, curate, and morph stories constantly. Throughout our lives, throughout our families, throughout our histories, throughout all the time that we've been here on Earth. We love stories, and I think that it is essential that we be mindful and smart about how much we lock away stories. Yes, as we've seen, locking them away can yield some really fascinating and creative opportunities. But on the whole, I think humankind is better served when we can draw upon our collective tales and build our modern collection of new and twice or thrice told tales. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lance. We have a few minutes for questions, if anyone has any questions.
Sure.
How was Hulk Hogan able to license his image with the WWE?
First, I would check with whether he copyrighted it or he trademarked it. Because trademark is a little bit different than copyright, but it does often end up kind of it's in that same wheelhouse, but it would be limited, so it wouldn't necessarily be after he passes away. But there is within trademark an ability to trademark images, an ability to trademark words. So Marvel and DC Comics have trademarked the word superhero. So that limits how it can be used in like titles or things like that. You could still use the word superhero, but you can't necessarily use it in defamatory ways, or you could potentially get in trouble legally.
Lance, would you mind if I made a point jumping off of yours about steampunk?
Go for it.
If anybody is interested in learning more about steampunk, Waltham, just south of here, does a steampunk festival.
Yes.
They'll be doing it in May, so
Yep.
if you're interested in, and they do a lot of cool things. Last year they had a Leviathan, which is actually part of the whole Iliad and Odyssey and everything that Lance has been talking about.
Yep. Yeah, I'm hoping to go this year because I now live in London, right next door. Cool.
Last call for questions? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.